Welcome to another episode of Lifestyle Matters. I'm Raven Guerrero, functional medicine health coach, cognitive behavioral hypnotherapist, and I am joined today by the lovely Cathy Williams, who is from New Zealand and a functional nutritionist and brain health coach. And she and I have met over Instagram, believe it or not, over the last couple of months. We've been having conversations about brain health, and cholesterol has been coming up a lot because we've been seeing a lot of stuff in the media around, about fat and about obesity and what you can do to lower your cholesterol. And we wanted to chat a little bit about that because having low cholesterol isn't always the greatest thing. In fact, it's one of those things that, we know that cholesterol is actually a really useful hormone in the body, and we wanted to get into that today. But before I do all that, I want Cathy to just tell us a little bit about why she got into functional nutrition and just some background. I want to get your backstory and share it with our audience.
Sure thing. Well, thank you so much for having me, first of all. So yeah, I'm from New Zealand. I studied back in New Zealand about 10 years ago. I did nutrition and naturopathy back before it was kind of even much of a big thing in New Zealand. It's kind of got a whole lot bigger since then. But I guess it started, my mother, I have to give her credit. She brought us up, I think, a bit like you mentioned, we sort of brought us up in a very holistic kind of, there was always homeopathy, there was always herbal remedies. We were seeing naturopaths as kids, and it always became kind of just the only thing that I ever wanted to do throughout high school was sort of work in natural health. It was the only thing I ever kind of considered doing. It was kind of like there wasn't really another option for me. So yeah, I ended up studying pretty much straight out of high school. I was one of the youngest. Most people come into the profession kind of as a second profession or retraining in it. But I was a fresh little 19-year-old and one of the youngest in my school. And yeah, I have kind of worked throughout the industry in various areas since then, on and off in supplement companies and practice and health food stores and on and off in the industry throughout, and sort of holding other roles in the health industry as well outside of nutrition and natural health. But in terms of the brain health aspect, I don't even know the year exactly, when my grandmother, my paternal grandmother, was about late 80s, I would say, about 88-ish. She was diagnosed with dementia. In the coming years. And even with all of my background of nutrition and natural health, I very much, I think I was in the same boat as a lot of other people. I assumed it was very much a genetic thing, and that we kind of didn't really have much say over whether we got it or not. It wasn't something that I was that familiar with. So I kind of dove into it a lot more, obviously having a relative with it, and started thinking, well, what does that actually mean for me? With a family history of it, and does that mean I should get tested, or what should I do? And am I going to get it myself and my family members? And that's kind of what catapulted me into this kind of specialism, I guess, because even with my knowledge of nutrition and naturopathy, I just was truly astounded at the amount of control we have over our brain health and dementia and Alzheimer's specifically, and just how much of it is within our control with nutrition and lifestyle practices. And it surprised me, even though I had some inkling, but the more I spoke to people about it, the more I realized that was almost completely unknown. And so it just became my mission in life to spread that word and to sort of really focus it on this area and help people see just how much control we have, and it kind of overflows into other conditions and areas as well. It's not just brain health, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, all these things, we have so much control with our daily habits and our nutrition and lifestyle, and that's just, I think it's super important to me to kind of get back to basics and look at things from a slightly preventative or proactive position.
Yeah, well, that's where you and I connect because we have a very
Yeah.
similar backstory. It was my grandfather who had dementia, and I ended up studying psychology because of that, because I wanted to know how to use non-pharmaceutical ways to help people with anxiety because his dementia was drug induced. He had been on Valium for 20 years and had just been going to his GP, who just kept giving him script after script after script, and there was no therapy or anything alongside that. And after being on pharmaceuticals for over that period of time, it your the arteries in your brain, they harden anyway
Mm.
as you get older, but when you're on pharmaceuticals, they actually increase and accelerate that hardening. So he ended up having multiple strokes and then ending up with dementia. So for me, it was like, okay, well, the root cause was dealing with the anxiety. How do you deal with the anxiety? And then of course that led me down the rabbit hole of, well, what goes on with the brain as we age and what can we do to protect it as we
Mm.
age? And that's when I looked into neuropsychology. And so all this stuff, like my dissertation for my final year was on the role of lifestyle factors like B vitamins, nutrition, aerobic activity, level of education on
Yeah.
prevention of age-related cognitive illnesses. And of course, yeah, B vitamins were huge in that. And that led me down another rabbit hole. Like, of course, I was like, oh, nutrition is a big part of this, like, and how you manage blood sugar. And a lot of what we're going to be talking about today is, we talk about cholesterol and how, we want to keep it really, really low. But sometimes I think the message has been sort of like muddled, particularly within
Mm.
the 80s, because we got a lot of mixed messaging around, we shouldn't be eating fat. We need to reduce fats in our diets. And what that has led to is an overconsumption of sugar. And then that obviously we know has detrimental effects on the brain, especially over a long period of time. And I'm
Absolutely.
guessing, like, when you study nutrition, you just said, like, there's this generalization, like the principles of good health, they don't only apply to age-related cognitive illnesses. It's not only about dementia. It can apply to diabetes, cardiovascular disease, women's issues. A lot of
Mm.
hormonal issues are down to blood sugar imbalances and
Yeah.
issues with metabolizing cholesterol. So I find it really interesting that, even though we say like functional medicine is about personalization, the principles underlying it are very much the same. Like, obviously, when we run labs and things, we want to know the baseline for you, your individual health. But at the same time, the principles that we're going to apply, we want to get your blood sugar regulated. The reason we measure is so that we can manage what we measure, which is why testing is
Absolutely.
so important, right? So I'm guessing you do a lot of that sort of stuff as well. Like, what would you say your top labs are for looking at prevention when it comes to these sorts of things?
So very similar to what you've mentioned. Actually, the biggest ones are like the cholesterol levels obviously are an important part, but also really underrated in terms of brain health is looking at the blood sugar levels, and at HbA1c, so the sort of long-term measure of blood sugar, and insulin resistance. So really keeping an eye on that, because there's, even before people get into a pre-diabetic range, so even, there's sort of the diabetic sort of range, blood sugar range, there's the pre-diabetes, and then even before that, if you're trending towards that, you're increasing your risk of dementia with every little increment that it goes up. So the sooner we can test those sorts of things, the much more control we have to kind of nip it in the bud and reverse those sorts of effects from really early on, before they get too far and before that damage is, I don't like to say it's ever irreversible, but, before the damage is too far gone. So yeah, blood sugar, B vitamins is a huge one. And then B vitamin deficiency in itself can mimic all of the symptoms of dementia and Alzheimer's. Vitamin D is a really big one, and that ties into the whole cholesterol topic. And the omega-3 index, which also ties into obviously the whole sort of fat discussion, which we'll get into, is another really big one. So those would be some of the most common ones that I would do, just as a baseline. And then sort of a lot of additional ones on top of that, hormonal levels, zinc, those sorts of things as well on top. But yeah, I like what you say about sort of I kind of look at it at two levels. There's kind of that those general principles that really form the baseline, and the base of this kind of health pyramid that we're looking at. And, the practices and the principles are common for so many people and for so many conditions and so many health outcomes. And then we can kind of tweak and modify those individually based on blood testing as needed. But so often it's just the basics we need to get right. And, those basics can go such a long way. So powerful.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, so true. And let's now jump in, because I feel like we've got the backstory. We know a little bit about how you work. Now tell us about cholesterol. What are some of the top 3 myths that people come to you? I know the ones that they come to me with. I want to hear what they come to you with, like when you have to try and change them around, like we've got to tweak your diet, and you have to start telling them, well, you need to eat more fat. And they're like, what?
Absolutely. And that's the biggest one, is literally just that they need fats, right? So a lot of people are still, despite the fact that many reviews have come out to completely debunk the whole connection between, high fat diets and cardiovascular disease and things like this. People's perceptions are very slow to change, and guidelines are very slow to change. I think it's only been in the past few years that finally the USDA has kind of dropped the whole low fat guidelines. So those sorts of things are slow to change, and even slower to kind of permeate down into the people that actually need it. So that's got to be the biggest one. Is I think people are either in 2 camps. They think that keto is the 100% everyone should do it, or they're still in the low fat camp. And kind of finding where people are at within that is interesting, and is probably one of the first steps. But the low fat myth is still rife, and it's really concerning from a mood and brain perspective in a big way, because the brain is fat. The brain is every cell, every neuron. It's just a big lump of fat in there, essentially. And
yeah, your myelin sheath is all fat, right? That's the thing that lines outside every single neuron. So yeah, that's fat. Mm-hmm.
And that's like Parkinson's disease, for example, is where that myelin sheath, and MS is where that myelin sheath is actually degraded, and you get sort of crosstalk between the neurons. And that is not just fat, but cholesterol. So it's this real sort of balance between, and there's no denying that some high cholesterol markers aren't particularly great, and that they can increase your risk. But there's this, I think the biggest thing is lumping fats into one big category, which is what we've kind of done so far. And it's a little bit lumping all carbohydrates in one big category, and kind of saying carbohydrates are carbohydrates, whether they're refined sugar or whether they're, a broccoli stick or something. It's the same with fats. You just can't lump them all into one category and say you have to eat low fat or you have to eat high fat. It's just not that straightforward. It's not that simple, and it's not that generalized. So I think that's kind of the base of that myth, is that sort of misunderstanding and misconception about all the different types of fats and exactly what they do and how they work in the body, and where they're used and what they're used for. And that's just not everyone will know that kind of biology, of course. Yeah. But hopefully that's where we can help people a little bit.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, funny story. My brother just came to live with me when I was in London because of COVID. He got stuck and he ended up at my apartment, and he thought, he was like, oh, I'm going to cook every day for you. I'm going to cook really healthy. And he basically was like roasting vegetables to the point where they were charred and with no butter on them or olive oil. And I'm like, why are we eating like this? And he said, well, because it's healthy. There's no oil on it. And I'm like, no, we need fat to absorb the nutrients from the vegetables, and charring Absolutely. It, you're basically blackening the broccoli, and that's like carcinogenic. Like, we don't want to be consuming blackened broccoli. So that's something that I don't think a lot of people realize, because he thinks that he's putting it on the George Foreman grill. There's no oil on it. It's very low fat. He's like, it's low fat. Like, I was like, no, but you're missing the point. Like, these things they've got synergistic relationships. You need the oils to bring out the nutrients, for certain
100%.
things. So again,
Yeah.
of course, the type of fat, I was saying olive oil or butter. A lot of people think butter is like the devil because back in the 80s, again, it was sort of demonized. And there was that whole "I can't believe it's not butter" campaign that came out that drove me nuts.
Yeah.
And even now I know people around me here in California who are like, "Oh, we're doing I can't believe it's not butter." And I'm like, no, it's not good for you. Like, you're
I'm
rotting
such a
your
butter
brain.
fan. I am a big fan of butter.
Okay, so
I love
healthy
it.
fats that are good for you: ghee, butter. What are the ones that I just listed? Olive oil. What are some of the other ones that people they don't need to be afraid of?
Don't need to be afraid of. Yeah, I mean, I think butter is a really a big one, and just to make a distinction there is that obviously there's, again, like anything, you can go even deeper, and there's good quality butter and not so great quality butter. So just like there's healthy fats and not so healthy fats, we can kind of work on this at deeper and deeper levels. And if we go
Amen.
into butter, then most certainly like the grass-fed butter is absolutely a tier above the rest because it has a much higher level of omega-3 in it. So that sort of gives it a bit of a higher ranking on the pedestal than regular butter, because those omega-3s are one of those fats that we're often deficient in. So getting more of that from your butter source is obviously just a win-win. Other sources of fats, that's where I was going with that. So yeah, extra virgin olive oil is just one of the best. I think it's brilliant. I think I'm a fan of coconut oil. Absolutely, I think there's a lot of kind of split sort of perceptions around coconut oil. But in terms of the makeup of coconut oil, it is slightly different. It's medium chain triglycerides, which are actually really, really beneficial for producing ketones, which is a great fuel for the brain. So especially for some people that might have insulin resistance, that sort of diabetes or insulin resistance kind of conditions, giving the brain some fuel in terms of in the form of ketones is really, really important. And so coconut oil can be a really great way of doing that. Like anything though, I think some people kind of tend to jump on these things and go, great, I'm going to eat like half a jar of coconut oil a day because it's good for my brain. Maybe not so much.
Quantities matter. I think that's one message we
Yeah,
need to get across. Quantities do matter. So you don't
100%.
need a jar of coconut oil. You might need a tablespoon. Okay.
Absolutely. And to the degree that a large amount of coconut oil may be more detrimental. So it's not like just more of a good thing is good. It can have slightly antimicrobial effects that can sort of offset or push off the balance of microbes in your gut, which gut balance is really important for brain health and for diabetes and for inflammation and all of this kind of stuff as well. So we don't want to overdo the good stuff and turn it into not so good stuff. So it's all about, yeah, like you say, quantity matters. It's all about balance and just being realistic with it, sort of eating it I like to think of eating it in the proportions that you would find it in nature and you would eat it in nature. And that goes for everything like sugar and, looking at it in the proportions that you would naturally find it occurring in nature is a really good way, rather than looking at it in the way that you find it on the supermarket shelves and hideously processed foods
That's
and
a
things like
really
that.
good tip. I like that. That's a good tip, because you're not going to find anything in a jar in nature. You're going to have to you have to work for it usually.
Exactly. And
You
it
got to
comes
work real hard to
packaged up.
extract something, right?
Yeah, and it's packaged up with all that other stuff. So it's, a coconut, you're not just getting the oil, you're getting the fiber and the husk and, all of that side of it, which is also really useful for different, purposes. And fiber is another big thing for cholesterol balance, which we can get into too. So it's looking at it kind of in realistic terms of what would we find this in nature, kind of common sense in a way, but something that we kind of get detached from when we're so used to seeing products packaged and jarred and on shelves and using them in those sorts of ways.
Yeah.
But yeah, those would be, and of course, oily fish. So if we're looking at non-plant-based fats, then I am a huge fan of the oily fish. I know we've mentioned this separately in our previous chat, but I am an advocate of including animal foods. I'm not so much an advocate of the vegan diet for various reasons, but most specifically that, you know, the level of omegas, the level of fats, the level of vitamin D, of B vitamins, B12 specifically, that are found in animal foods is just for the brain, you know, brain health, and it's just crucial. It's really, really crucial.
So interesting that you said that, because I just came back from, like I said, 4 days at this conference, and Dr. Nasha Winters, who wrote The Metabolic Approach to Cancer, she listed this fabulous slide with all the risk factors that she assesses when someone comes to her. And one of the risk factors was vegan or vegetarian diet. And I was like, aha, I knew it. Like, I knew it, like eating only plants was not a great thing. Like, you need to include some level of animal protein, because plants, I don't know if you've heard Stephen Gundry talk about this before. And for our audience, Stephen Gundry is a medical doctor who's written a book called The Plant Paradox. And he has said that, you know, even though people think that plants are amazing, and they are, like, they really, really are, they do have polyphenols and all the great things that we need from them. By consuming only plants and consuming them out of season, and all these different factors that we need to think about when we're foraging and we're going to eat them, they release a lot of toxins because they're trying to protect and defend themselves. So things like spinach, which people historically think is like a health food, or kale, very high in oxalates and can be quite damaging and detrimental to the gut. And they need to be paired with other things, or cooked or prepared in a different way, in order for you to receive the benefits that you think that you're going to get from, let's say, eating raw kale. Raw kale is definitely a no-no in my book. I've seen it debunked. You know, people have, Dave Asprey hates talking. He's like, nobody should eat kale. Like, it's just a bad idea. Stephen Gundry talks about it all the time as well. So it was interesting that I saw this thing on Dr. Winter's slides where she was like risk factors, and one of them was vegan vegetarian diet for cancer, which is interesting.
I think also there's a big, and that's kind of a different sort of myth and misconception, is that because of the whole kind of climate discussion, there's this kind of, for people that are, you know, health conscious, there's this big perception that veganism is the most healthful diet. And I think that kind of is just, I think that we could do with eating a lot less meat than we typically do. Like you say, quantity matters. I think, you know, we definitely overconsume meat products, and I think we overconsume them in place of other plant foods that could be beneficial. But I don't think that the an entirely vegan or vegetarian approach, vegetarian borderline, but especially the vegan approach, I just you know, there's just too many crucial nutrients that are needed. And I think it's kind of as much marketing hype that people kind of think, oh, veganism is healthy, without kind of knowing the intricacies of actually how the nutrients work and how much we need and where we actually get it from, and how it's formed. On the topic of fats, one of the reasons why, and one of the other kind of misconceptions, is that you can get all of the healthy fats that you need from vegetable or from plant foods. So like nuts and seeds, for example, are always touted as, you know, you don't need to eat fish or you know, animal sources of omega-3s because you get plenty from nuts and seeds. And it's just simply not true. And again, we can kind of dig a bit deeper into this and look at the different types of omega-3. So again, even just saying all omega-3s are good is still too broad. Like, no matter how deep we go, there's these intricacies. And so there's a couple of different sorts of omega-3s. EPA and DHA are the ones that are the most beneficial for brain health, and we need in the biggest quantities. ALA is what is found in the nuts and seeds. And so it can sound great, like, yes, nuts and seeds do contain omega-3s, but it's the different form, and that form in particular is not usable by the body in that ALA form, so the body has to convert it. There's very small amounts in nuts to begin with, and then the amount that actually gets converted into EPA or DHA is about 1%. So we just simply can't meet the big demands of our big, hungry, fat-hungry brains. We just can't meet those demands through plant foods. It's just, and I see it time and again, people following vegetarian and vegan diets that just start to feel rubbish, right? They just get the brain fog and they get the lethargy, and they just aren't quite performing and functioning as well as they could, and often they are severely deficient in omega-3s. And even people that eat meat, eat fish, and animal products can also, I eat them. I eat fish, I eat meat products, I eat eggs, I use the oils, and one of my recent tests about 18 months ago came back deficient in omega-3s. So, even, again, comes back to your point about the importance of testing, because I would have looked at my diet and gone, yeah, that's great, but obviously something's not getting through. I'm not absorbing it properly. I'm using it more than I'm consuming. So we kind of need to do those little deeper investigations and determine whether the diet that somebody is currently on is actually meeting those needs on a biochemical level and on that kind of, biomarker level. Which I think is just really important to kind of steer the changes and the things that you implement, the treatment strategies that you implement.
So true, because how many times have you had clients who come to you and say, oh, I eat really healthy, but then, like you said, you run some labs and you're like, well, maybe you are eating really well, but for whatever reason you're not absorbing, you're not converting, you're not methylating things in the right way. So okay, so I that's a whole other tangent that we could go off on, but I want to keep this ship on track.
Keep us on track.
Yeah, keep us on course, because there is something that you did say a little while ago about the different types of omegas, and what the brain actually requires is that it's EHA, isn't it? It requires that different type of cholesterol. So the ALA, yeah, you can get that from nuts and seeds, but what you're getting from animal fat is what the brain actually needs, correct?
It is, yep. And there's something that I read, a quote which literally was like, animal products contain saturated fats and fats because animal products need those fats. So it's kind of like, it's that, in nature, the animals that we do eat, that they do contain levels of these things because they need it, and we're no different in that way, and those sorts of those nutrients that we do need. So yeah, the types of omega-3 are super important when it comes to choosing food options.
Okay, that's great to know. So we've kind of highlighted there was more than 3 top fats to consume. We went through coconut oil, but again, and I'm caveating all of this with, quantities matter, really important. 100%. That's where working with someone as well will help you figure out what works best for you. Because again, there is no one size fits all approach. You've got to really be personalized when it comes to nutrition. Don't take your advice from Tatler or Vogue or whatever the other magazines are that are out there that'll be like, oh, the keto is the best thing for you. Like, it might be good for some people, it might not be good for everyone depending on your needs. I've seen a lot of women not do well on a ketogenic diet. It starts messing up their hormones because they are missing out on certain other things. So I think it's really important for us to remember that these blanket sort of like sweeping statements that this is the holy grail of nutrition, or a vegan diet is the holy grail, or the keto, it doesn't work like that. You've got to be very, very individualized and very personalized when you're approaching these sorts of things, and work with someone who actually knows this. Otherwise, you're stuck in a cycle of trial and error and not getting anywhere. And you might even be screwing things up, because there are people with genetic variances who should not be consuming coconut oil, because by doing that it turns on their ApoE4 gene. So I do a lot of genetic testing. I don't know, do you do that as well? Do you do things like genetic testing?
I haven't, to be honest. So I do work with some people who have already had, obviously from the dementia and Alzheimer's side of things, I do work with people that have already had the ApoE gene testing, so they know what variant of that they have. But that's a brilliant example of how without that sort of testing, we are guessing, and we can guess well. If you don't want a genetic test, we can guess well, better by doing those other testing and making sure the other biomarkers are under control, because that's kind of the ideal result, is that those other cholesterol, omega markers, all those inflammation, all of those markers are within optimal range. But we're just we're just guessing. We're so individual in the way that we metabolize and use nutrients that we just can't have these blanket statements. Like, you're right in terms of the keto diet, for example, people that say that everyone should be on it. You know, there's studies to show that it can increase cardiovascular risk in some people and it can decrease it dramatically in others. Like, it's just, we're just not that straightforward as human beings. Unfortunately, our bodies are just much more complex and much more individualized than that. Yeah, and that's just, I think the biggest take home is that it's so important to get that tailored advice to kind of optimize and tweak those sort of aspects.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that's probably the biggest thing that I do want most people to walk away with. Just sort of like, one size does not fit all. The principles of health are definitely all pretty much identical. You need to focus on nutrition. You need to focus on rest and recovery and sleep. You need to focus on exercise. You need to focus on reducing stress, whether that's psychological stress, that's external, or you work on reducing your internal stressors. So that might be your parasites, your imbalance of gut bacteria, your thyroid, your hormones, whatever. Work on reducing those stressors. And then also looking at your supplementation. Because unfortunately, people often question me like, well, why do I need to get expensive supplements? I said, well, because the cheap stuff doesn't get absorbed. And they're like, well, can't I get everything I need through my nutrition? And the other answer to that is maybe 50 years ago or 60 years ago, you could have, but we're at a point now where we are factory farming, over farming, the soils are depleted. We do not get the same levels of nutrients, and our animals are not getting the same levels of nutrients anymore either. So even if, let's say, you are eating, grass-fed organic beef or having cage-free hens, they're not getting the eggs, cage-free eggs, cage-free hens. But even then, you're not getting the same levels of nutrients that, your grandmother would have gotten,
Absolutely.
So that's also something to bear in mind. That the reason that we do recommend supplementation is because we have these, we're living in a world where we're not raising our own animals or rearing them or growing our own food anymore. We're relying on someone else to do that. And that's being mass produced. And that means that we're never going to be getting the level of nutrient density that we're going to require for our bodies and our brains to function well. So I guess my next question would be around, obviously we've seen that cholesterol is vital for the brain to function. Now, how do we keep it in balance? Because, when you go to your doctor and they run a test and they say, oh, your cholesterol is high, how do we keep that ratio, and what's the best ratio? Like, I guess those are two questions right there. So what's the best ratio, and then how do we keep it in a good place?
So again, there's that kind of the idea of drilling down a little bit deeper as well, isn't there, with cholesterol? That again, sort of saying all cholesterol, and many doctors now, they obviously know that looking at total cholesterol amount is pretty arbitrary. It doesn't really mean anything, that number. So breaking it down into obviously the specifics, like you say, the like LDL and the HDL, and getting the right sort of ratios between that. But also, you can go a little bit deeper than that as well. So even with LDL, so the difference, just briefly, is sort of the LDL is basically what is considered the bad cholesterol, to kind of the one that takes it from the liver out into the tissues, and HDL is what kind of brings it the other way around, so back to the liver from the bloodstream and the tissues. So it's considered good because it's kind of taking it away. But both of these are really important, right? Because the body needs cholesterol, like you were saying, to create vitamin D, to create all our sex hormones. We need that there. So the LDL, we don't want it too low. And there's some, like anything, there's some really conflicting science around the different cholesterol levels and the risk. So for example, when I look at things like the cholesterol relationship to the risk of dementia, there's some things that even say too low of an LDL ratio level increases your risk of dementia. So it's not that we want to lower it. I think you mentioned at the start, we don't want to get it like as low as possible. That's not kind of the aim, because we need it. We need it in certain amounts to create all these other things that we need to create. So kind of looking at them as just good and bad and getting one high and one low is again a bit kind of too high level. And when we look at LDL, there's actually more specifically the particle size, and there's, without getting into too much sciencey stuff, there's like the small dense LDL particles. So there's even different sorts of LDL, and there's a lot of tests that kind of show those markers are actually more indicative of risk and are a better way of predicting both cardiovascular risk and other risk, looking at the type of LDL and the ratio of different sorts of LDL. So we can kind of get more and more granular with it until we can kind of pinpoint the actual problematic parts of it. But I think you also mentioned in one of your previous emails sort of about how do we keep the levels within healthy ranges. A lot of it is not at all to do, well, it's almost entirely not at all to do with our dietary intake of cholesterol. The dietary intake of cholesterol barely influences our internal cholesterol levels at all. It has very, very small difference. Most of the cholesterol is made internally, either in the liver or in the brain, and it will make how much it needs whether you eat it or not. So the dietary cholesterol specifically is not really influencing the levels within the body. But what you've kind of tapped into before is a little bit about the actual carbohydrates and the insulin levels and the refined processed carbohydrates that actually drive cholesterol levels more so. So rather than kind of focusing on reducing cholesterol containing foods or limiting our fat intake and looking at that side of things, we almost need to shift focus and kind of look at what's driving that cholesterol to be high within us in the first place. And often that does come down to those other dietary choices, so the refined carbohydrates. And it's worth noting that in terms of the sort of atherosclerosis, so the actual hardening of the arteries and the cholesterol deposits in the arteries that are kind of what causes the problems for cardiovascular disease. There's some kind of damage that occurs there first, which then kind of attracts and causes the cholesterol to accumulate there in these plaques. So it's not necessarily that cholesterol's kind of going around causing the problem. It's almost that they're there sort of as a collateral part of a bigger picture. And high blood pressure, inflammation, high blood sugar, so diabetes, those sorts of things are actually what causes that damage in the first place and causes the cholesterol to kind of have the opportunity to build up. So that's where this kind of disconnect comes between one of my tutors. I still remember this even though it was a long time ago. One of my tutors gave a perfect analogy of this, which was saying that cholesterol is the culprit behind cardiovascular disease is a little bit like saying that firefighters are causing all the fires. Just because there's a lot of them around, like just because we see a lot of firefighters at every fire, we could easily go, well, there's always firefighters at every fire, so they must be the cause. When in fact they're not. They're there because someone lit a fire in the first place and they're trying to fix that problem. And cholesterol is very similar in that there's something going on, there's a process going on, and the cholesterol is kind of there as collateral. So it's not necessarily a causative, but more of a correlation. So in terms of keeping the cholesterol healthy levels, it's looking at that wider picture and those other health markers that we've talked about, the blood sugar, the inflammation, and the other dietary choices, and keeping those in line to, promote wider health rather than focusing really specifically on those fat and cholesterol intake.
Fantastic. I think that's a perfect place for us to conclude this discussion, because it's always going to come back to, we have to look at the whole picture rather than this reductionist way of looking at things, which unfortunately our conventional system, they have a little ways to go, but because they are very much targeted on, okay, well, you've got high cholesterol, I'll give you statins, without asking, well, why have you got high cholesterol? And very recently 100%. I had a client come to me saying that she was feeling extremely tired. She'd been suffering with like severe exhaustion, brain fog. She couldn't really think straight, had a lot of trouble concentrating, a lot of issues with her sleep as well. That's one of the main complaints. And then, in doing our initial conversation, I found out a lot of other things that were going on with her. And then throughout that, toward the end of it, discovered, oh, she's been on statins for like 10 years. I'm like, okay. I'm like, do you think maybe that might have something to do with it? Because it basically depletes the cholesterol that your brain is going to need in order to be able to function well, right? And she's like, well, no, I need the statins to survive. And I'm like, oh boy. So I had a lot of work to do there, because I had a lot of education, which is one of the reasons that prompted me to record this video, actually, because I was like, there's still so much misinformation floating around out there that doctors, unfortunately, God bless them, they're great in life-saving situations, but in these lifestyle-related type conditions, they've put this thing into this poor woman's head that she will die if she's not on her statins, rather than thinking, well, okay, well, what can I do around my health to optimize? Because she just wanted to be able to sleep and be able to think clearly and not be tired all the time. And then I was like, well, the first thing you need to do is change how you eat, because she was eating low-fat everything was a vegan. And there were a few
as well as being on statins.
So she was tanking, like her hormones were a mess. She was in her late 40s. Hormones were like a mess. Brain was completely fuzzy, not getting any sleep, really, sleep deprived, and just not doing she's just not functioning optimally at all, poor thing. So
one of the big things too with statins is that the way that they work is they also, and again, sort of collateral damage, they also sort of wipe out a lot of the CoQ10 production. And
which is for energy
in the brain, like the brain is our biggest user of energy, and that CoQ10 just being suboptimal just means the brain simply can't function. And again, with low fat, the cell membranes are all fat. They can't get the nutrients in and out that they need. They simply just can't function. And yeah, it's no surprises we get people that are brain fogged and
and confused too, because they don't understand why you would say, well, get off your meds. I'm not going to ever say get off your meds. I'm like, we're going to have to work on understanding why your body's not working the way that it's supposed to. And then when we figure out, oh, there are a couple of things here that probably we could work on, and we could look at reducing over time and titrating off and improving. And when you take things out, you've got to put stuff back in. And that's also something that I would love to make sure that everyone gets across. Like, we're never ever just going to be removing something that's giving you, like, let's say, an energy source and then leaving you stranded. Like, we're going to be looking at, well, how can we help you with your energy production? Will it be through supplements? Will it be through the nutrition? Will it be through helping you get better sleep? All those sorts of things. So in her case, we had to definitely do some testing to look at her liver to see what was going on there, because no doubt, the statins as well, they damage your liver long term. So needed to look at that, how they were, see how she was functioning, and then start cleaning up the gut and all the other things to make sure she was actually absorbing nutrients, and get her on some really nice high strength therapeutic grade supplements, and optimizing every cell, tissue, and organ so that the body could actually do what it's meant to. And then she's no longer needing, because cholesterol is not a statin deficiency, like,
exactly.
It's not, you're not deficient in statins. And I love that firefighter analogy. I think that's probably one of the best ones I've heard. There's like, oh, well, there's firefighters, they must be the problem. Like, no, cholesterol is like is the byproduct of the real problem. So
real problem.
So what's the problem? And that's where, your work, my work, the way that we think about things, which differs to the sort of traditional approach, it can be so helpful and life-changing and really, really fast. I don't think anyone realizes, like, by running a couple of labs, within 2 weeks, you're going to get answers and clarity on why things have been malfunctioning for so long. That was my story. Like, when I ended up running my GI map for the first time, I was like, oh, now I know what's going on, because, like this actually, because before, they're like, you just got IBS, you just have to live with it. I'm like, I don't have to live with it. Please tell me I don't have to live like this. Like, this is terrible.
And that's the other side of the supplements too, right? Is you can rectify those deficiencies, even things like vitamin D. Like, it's not to say that you're going to need to take that for the rest of your life.
Exactly. You can
because often people are very good at maintaining a very specific but deficient level. They can maintain that level fine, and it's kind of, we're just a few notches down from where we want to be. So if we can get back up with supplementation, get people feeling a bit better off the bat so that they actually have the energy and motivation to make more dietary changes and lifestyle changes, and then go back to maintaining, they can often maintain that higher level just as easy as they could before. But it's just bridging that gap in the short term that's really important, and that's where those targeted supplements just come in so handy.
Yeah, bridging the gap. Well, Cathy, thank you so much. I have thoroughly enjoyed talking to you. I just wonder if anyone has any questions. We've probably got about another 5 minutes, so you can use that time to drop. Mark, you have a question?
Yes, I do. Thank you so much for great information so far. Glad I stopped driving so I could take notes. So could I ask about intermittent fasting? Is that something that you recommend? And if so, is it recommended or not? And if so, how important is it to do that fasting during the nighttime? Don't eat right before you go to bed.
So I am a great fan of intermittent fasting. I do it myself. So I pretty much do a 16-8 pattern most days. I find just about everybody that tries it absolutely loves it. And any reservations they had about it whatsoever are gone within the first week. I'm a big believer of it. I think it's really, really fantastic. And when you say how important is it to do in the evening, do you mean just in the to start a few hours before dinner, or? Well,
I mean, if you eat right up to the time that you go to bed, say you go to bed at 12 o'clock and you're eating between 8 and right up until 12, and your fasting then most of it is going to come after the night is over when you're awake. Is the time, there's something important in the bodily functions with this fasting. I'm sure you could tell us all about it, and I would love to hear it. But, do you get that benefit while you're sleeping, or can you also get that benefit during the day while you're fasting?
Yeah, you'll get the benefit from the fasting, because essentially the fasting is both keeping your insulin at baseline, so that whole kind of keeping your blood sugar low and keeping that insulin level low for a longer stretch of time than most people do, which is sometimes barely the 7 hours of sleep they get, because they're kind of stuffing their face from wake to sleep. So I'm a big fan of more fitting it into circadian rhythms, so kind of doing the fasting at about the same times each day so that you do get into this rhythm, because there is some research that fasting along with the circadian rhythms is both easier to get into a cycle with, easier to kind of build a habit, and also just slightly better in terms of different hormone fluctuations and that kind of thing. But in terms of the exact time frames, I find that it actually is quite individual. And again, it kind of depends on, some people are just big breakfast eaters and some people just really aren't. And I think we naturally have some slight differences in our preferences of when we want to eat and when we like to eat, and how our body kind of works with different foods at different times of the day. I've never been a big breakfast eater. I've always had to force myself to eat breakfast. So for me, fasting, extending my fast and fasting mostly during the day is easy for me, and works perfect. But I know other people that do it the other way around, and they actually eat between 8 a.m. and say 4 p.m. That way, because they literally can't function in the morning without food. So I think it's a bit of an individual kind of thing and something to experiment with. And what I kind of tend to suggest is when you're experimenting, say you currently eat between, say you have breakfast at 7 and, at a more extreme end, someone might have dinner through till like 9, 10, 11 p.m. at night. I suggest just kind of like start working on, at either side, just kind of slowly bringing those hours in, and rather than kind of drastically trying to find a window. So kind of just inching those end times up a little bit, and you'll kind of get to feel what works for you and what kind of routine is working for you. There is some evidence, I know Bredesen, Dr. Bredesen, if you're familiar with him, he suggests a 3 hours, finishing eating 3 hours before bed. And there is some evidence that works to kind of go to bed not digesting food, to sort of have that your stomach empty and have your blood sugar kind of a little bit more returning to normal before you try and go to sleep. Some people find that a bit easier, but it's all very individual. So I personally just get people to experiment and kind of think about when they naturally would eat and sort of just scooch up those end times a little bit and find, play with it a little bit and see what really works for you.
Thank you very much.
No worries.
Well, I think that's it. Orlando, who was our other participant, he's had to run, but he said he had loads of questions, but he's going to email them over, because he said this was all fantastic information and stuff that he's going to be able to use, but he has tons of questions for us as well. So
awesome. No worries.
Yeah, really, really exciting. I feel like we've covered a lot. Like, it started off being cholesterol. We kind of got into blood sugar, went off on a bunch of tangents, which is always the way, because this is just, for me, like, I can never, ever stop learning, understanding, expanding my mind on all of these things. And it's always really exciting to meet other people and hear their other approaches to how they would deal with some of this as well. So thank you so much for that, for your insight and for your wisdom. I really feel like I could feel, like you said, you've been doing this pretty much since you were like little. You were just born to do it. And I get that sense from you. Like, it definitely, for me, was, I used to think I'm never going to be a medical doctor, but I was going to become a head doctor. So that's why I studied psychology. I couldn't handle cutting open cadavers. Like, I was like cutting open frogs and everything just grossed me the hell out. I was like, there is no way I could deal with blood or guts or any of that. So I'm going to have to work on people's brains.
Yeah.
And then I didn't like the idea of having to be set up in like a clinical psychology setting where you have to work with really, schizophrenics, bipolar, catatonics. I was like, no, I can't get into that either. So I was like, what am I going to do? And I was like, coaching. Got it, hypnotherapy.
Mix, isn't it? Like,
yeah, no, it really worked out, optimizing brain health, optimizing mental health, rather than looking at dysfunction so much. So it's been kind of cool, like meeting someone who's on a very similar mission. I like that. I love when we're on our missions and we've known it from day one.
yeah, that's it, right?
Yeah, wherever you are, you're taking good care of yourself, and speak soon, okay?
Lovely. Thanks, Raywin.